I did not want to marry a 60-year-old man, but I was forced into it by my parents. Every morning, as soon as I woke, my mother would stand before me with tears in her eyes, her face marked by sorrow and urgency. She would say, "If you do not marry this man, he will ruin the lives of all of us." Her words, laden with despair and warning, left me feeling utterly helpless. I knew in my heart that this man was dangerous, capable of doing anything he wished, but my own stubborn heart refused to give in without a fight. Adding to my terror was the warning from a dear friend whose words haunted me night after night. She had warned me, in a voice trembling with fear, that if I married this 60-year-old man on our wedding night, he might treat me so roughly that my very soul would tremble in terror. Her description was so vivid that I lay awake for hours, the dread of that possibility keeping sleep at bay. The fear in her tone was not merely cautionary, it was an omen of the unspeakable fate that might befall me. As the day of my wedding drew nearer, now only 1 week away, I found myself sitting in the courtyard one afternoon when there was an abrupt knock on the door. The door, already ajar, allowed the visitor to slip inside. To my shock and dismay, the person who entered was none other than my soon-to-be husband, a 60-year-old imposing old man whose very presence ignited a storm of anger and apprehension within me. Though I felt my blood boil at the sight of him, I struggled hard to keep my emotions in check. I did not want to create a scene or bring misery upon my family. He stood there, his eyes roaming over me in a way that made me feel exposed and vulnerable. After a few moments, he slowly advanced toward me, his gaze fixed unsettlingly on my waist. I registered every detail of his disturbing look, and a deep sense of foreboding gripped me. For what seemed like an eternity, he stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I desperately wished to avert my eyes, to escape the heat of his scrutiny, yet there was no escape. There was no one else in the house to hide behind. Even more chilling was his silence. Not a single word passed his lips as he continued his invasive, unblinking gaze. I found myself unable to speak. There was nothing I felt I could say that might diffuse the situation, and I feared that if I did speak, I would only provoke him further. As he drew 2 or 3 steps closer, his focus remained locked on my waist. I quickly recoiled, my heart pounding with fear. In what felt like only moments, he came so near that I could sense every breath on my skin. Then, in a low and mysterious tone, he began to speak. "I can hardly believe you are such a beautiful girl." Though his words were softly delivered, the way his eyes remained fixed on my body filled me with terror. Just the previous night, my friend had confided in me grim details, warning that before the wedding, he might attempt to do things that would test my endurance to the breaking point. She had even suggested that if I failed this unspoken trial, he would not accept me as his bride at all. Rather, I would become nothing more than his slave. Those words, uttered in trembling secrecy, had left me sleepless and haunted by fear. I felt completely trapped. I had no idea what prayer to offer for deliverance. If I prayed that this ordeal would happen, I was certain it would only strengthen his resolve. But if I prayed against it, my family's stern expectations would come crashing down on me. I was ensnared in a web of duty, fear, and sorrow, desperately searching for Allah's help while the old man loomed over me like a sinister specter. In a fleeting, wild thought, I wished I could pick up a stone and smash his head to end his dark story once and for all. Yet I knew that if I acted on that impulse, the 15 or 16 guards waiting outside would storm in and pelt me with bullets without hesitation. Helplessness reigned in every corner of that moment. After a few agonizing minutes, he abruptly gestured toward a room and said, "Come inside. I have something very important to discuss with you." His eyes, cold and unchanging, remained fixed on me as he spoke. I tried desperately to shrink back, to hide from his penetrating stare, but my efforts proved futile. I managed to stammer, I do not wish to speak with you right now, and besides, there is no one else here. It wouldn't be proper for us to be alone in a room when the family is absent." My words did nothing to soothe him. Instead, they only incited his anger. His forehead furrowed, and without warning, he grabbed my arm with a force that left no room for negotiation. "How dare you refuse me?" he thundered. "You have no idea what a mistake it is to deny me. Come on, hurry into the room, or there will be consequences you cannot imagine." Before I knew it, he began pushing me toward the room with a force that made my heart race with terror. I realized with a sinking dread that I might have to endure this violation more than once, perhaps 2 or 3 times, if I did not muster the courage to stand up. In a haze of fear, I allowed him to force his way into my room. My heart pounded so furiously that I felt as if it might burst from my chest. There he stood, looming like a dark, oppressive figure over me, his eyes fixed on me as if daring me to defy him. In that instant, a wild thought crossed my mind, to gouge out his eyes and rid myself of his evil presence, but I was utterly powerless to act. After a while, he indicated a nearby chair and commanded me to sit. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of relief, thinking that perhaps he intended to speak rather than to continue his assault. I began to lower myself into the chair, only to have my heart leap into my throat when his strange, deliberate movements made me feel as if I were on the brink of being overwhelmed once again. I tried to leave to escape the confines of that room and the nightmare unfolding around me, but every movement was thwarted by the palpable, paralyzing fear that gripped me. Then, as if fate itself were toying with me, there was an abrupt knock on the door. I turned toward the sound, and surprisingly, the knock carried a note of pleasant familiarity, an unexpected interruption amid the terror. For a moment, I allowed myself to be distracted by the sound. Even the old man's face contorted in dismay, his eyes flashing with anger, as if he could not tolerate the interruption. He glared at me once more and, with an ominous tone, threatened, "Today you are safe, but next time won't be so lucky. I will return. Mark my words, Butts." With that, he hastily exited through the door. Outside, one of his guards was waiting. The guard whispered something into his ear, further inflaming his anger, and together they left the room in a flurry of departure. I sank to the floor, drawing a deep, shuddering breath as I tried to steady my trembling heart. My pulse pounded in my ears like a drum, echoing the terror that coursed through every fiber of my being. I remained on the cold floor for what felt like an eternity, my mind reeling from the shock and sorrow of what had just transpired. No sooner had I begun to collect myself than my mother burst into the room. Her eyes widened in alarm as she saw me sitting there, visibly shaken and disheveled. "What has happened?" she demanded, rushing toward me. "Why are you sitting like this? What did that man do to you?" Before she could say another word, I placed my finger on her lips, pleading in a soft yet urgent whisper, "For Allah's sake, mother, please do not speak such things. You cannot imagine how terribly I have suffered at his hands. If his guard hadn't been present today, I fear you might have scolded me for showing even a hint of disobedience." I struggled to explain the unspeakable horror I had just endured, my voice barely a whisper as I recounted every detail of the encounter. My mother's face fell, a mix of horror and resignation crossing her features. "My dear," she said in a trembling tone, "sometimes in our culture we are forced to endure these hardships. It is our tradition, a ritual you must obey." Even as she spoke, her eyes betrayed the pain of knowing that I was about to be subjected to a life that no one should ever have to endure. I sat there in utter despair, overwhelmed by the realization that I was being compelled to submit to a fate that stripped me of my dignity and freedom. The old man, with his cold cruelty and unyielding authority, was not the man of my choosing, but rather the embodiment of a patriarchal system that cared nothing for my feelings or my future. I had heard whispers in the community, stories that he already had 3 wives, that he married every 3 years only to discard the previous ones with a swift divorce. The thought that I might become merely another discarded wife filled me with revulsion and despair. In the hours that followed, the gravity of my situation settled like a heavy shroud over me. I recalled in detail every word my friend had uttered, every fearful warning that had hinted at the unspeakable acts he might commit on our wedding night. The idea that he might test me in such a brutal manner, and that failing such a test would leave me not as his bride but as his slave, was a terror I could hardly bear. I felt as if my very soul was being weighed down by an inexorable fate, a fate determined long before I was ever given a choice. In the midst of that overwhelming night, I realized that the old man's intrusion was not merely a physical violation, but a symbolic act, a representation of all the oppression that my family and society had forced upon me over the years. In every tearful morning and every forced smile, I saw echoes of past generations trapped in a similar web of duty and fear. I could almost hear the silent cries of countless women sacrificed on the altar of tradition. It was in that moment I silently vowed that if ever given the chance, I would fight with every ounce of strength to break free from these chains and reclaim the dignity that had been stolen from me. In the days that followed, as the reality of my impending marriage loomed larger, I began to notice small sparks of resistance within my own heart. In the quiet solitude of my room, I started to observe every routine in the household, the patrols of the guards outside, the subtle shifts in conversation, even the creaks of the old floorboards, as if they might hint at a moment when I could vanish without being noticed. Every little detail became part of a secret ledger of hope, a silent testament to my desire to survive, even if it seemed an impossible dream. I also recalled my friend's warnings, her voice still echoing in my ears with every fearful beat of my heart. She had recounted stories of women who had faced similar horrors yet managed to hold on to their inner light despite the darkness. In her words lay a glimmer of hope, a fragile possibility that one day I too might reclaim my life and break free from this cruel destiny. Though those dreams were fragile and often overshadowed by the dread that filled my every waking moment, they gave me something to cling to during the long, lonely nights. Each day that passed was a relentless countdown to my wedding day. I oscillated between paralyzing fear and a desperate yearning for liberation. I questioned the cruelty of fate, the harshness of traditions that reduced a woman's life to nothing more than a series of obligations, and the moral decay that allowed such inhumane practices to persist. The memory of his cold, calculating eyes, an ever-present reminder of the man who would soon become my husband, haunted me. It was as if every shadow in the house whispered his name, every silent corner bore witness to the impending violation of my very self. In those quiet, sleepless hours, I often found myself reflecting on the dreams of my childhood, a time when I believed in a world filled with hope, where I was free to choose my own destiny. I longed for the days when my greatest fear was a thunderstorm outside, not the threat of a man whose cruelty was as boundless as it was chilling. Those dreams, however distant they seemed, were the only light I had in the oppressive darkness that now defined my existence. As the final days before the wedding approached, I felt as though I was standing on the edge of an abyss. Every moment was an agonizing reminder that I was about to enter a life that I had never chosen, a life dictated by the unyielding demands of tradition and the iron will of a man whose reputation for cruelty was well known. And yet, in the midst of all this despair, I resolved to cling to even the smallest ember of hope. I silently vowed that if I survived this ordeal, I would not only seek my own liberation, but would also fight for the rights and dignity of all those who, like me, had been forced into lives of misery and oppression. Thus, as the echoes of that dreadful night mingled with the soft, sorrowful whispers of my thoughts, I understood with painful clarity that my life was about to change irrevocably. The road ahead was shrouded in uncertainty and peril, yet I resolved to face it with a spirit that, though battered and bruised, would not be completely extinguished. I promised myself that I would endure, even if every heartbeat reminded me of the horror that awaited me, and that someday, somehow, I would reclaim the freedom and dignity that were rightfully mine. In that final, heart-wrenching moment of reflection, I recognized that my struggle was not only against one cruel man, but against an entire system built on oppression and fear. The old man's looming shadow was but a symbol of the larger forces at work, a society that viewed a woman's worth in terms of obedience and submission. And though I trembled at the thought of the future, deep inside I nurtured a fierce, unspoken determination, a quiet promise that I would not let my spirit be broken, no matter how heavy the chains of fate might be. Looking back on that day now, as I recount every agonizing detail with a trembling hand and a heavy heart, I know that my life was forever altered by the events that unfolded in that oppressive room. The terror, the helplessness, and the overwhelming sorrow still echo in my mind, each memory a painful reminder of a destiny imposed upon me without consent. Yet, amid that darkness, a small, stubborn hope flickers. A hope that one day I might rise above this nightmare and forge a future defined not by the cruelty of tradition, but by the strength of my own will. And so, as I sit here, haunted by the past, yet daring to dream of a future free from the shackles of oppression, I resolve to keep that ember of hope burning bright. For in every tear and every trembling heartbeat, there lies the quiet promise of a new beginning, a promise that I will one day reclaim my life, no matter the cost. This narrative stands as a testament to the inner turmoil, fear, and resilience that defined my struggle. It is a chronicle of a life forced into a union with a man whose very presence threatened to shatter the delicate fabric of my soul. Even as I trembled in despair at the thought of my impending marriage, a union marked by the cruelty of a man who, as I had been told, already had 3 wives and who divorced them every 3 years, I clung to a quiet determination. Though I knew deep down that his intentions were to reduce me to nothing more than his slave, I resolved that my spirit would never be entirely broken. In that mix of terror and defiance, I also silently prayed that one day the world might change, that the voices of countless women who had suffered in silence would rise up in unison to demand a life of dignity and freedom. Even if my future was cast in shadow, I vowed to honor my own worth and to fight for the light that flickered in my heart, a light that, despite all odds, refused to be extinguished. It was precisely for this very reason that I was so terribly afraid. In my heart, I knew that if, after 3 long years, he were to divorce me, I would be left with absolutely nothing. I only longed for a way out, a desperate escape from this man who had become my torment, and dreamed of fleeing to a place where I could finally feel safe and secure. I had even planned to run away to my maternal aunt's house. However, it was not solely for my own sake that I entertained this thought. I was equally troubled by the idea that my running away might cause my family to be drawn into even deeper trouble. I had already advised my mother that we should take refuge at my aunt's place, knowing full well that they knew nothing about her. Yet, it seemed as though my mother herself did not really wish to take that step. After all, Malik had offered her a very large sum of money, a sum that my mother, with all her greedy ambitions, could not easily refuse. The next day, since there was very little work at home, my mother instructed me rather curtly. This little errand is not something I can delay any longer. Hurry and go to the well and fetch some water. We have run out of fresh water in the house, and you must know that in just a short while your father will be arriving, and you know well that he always insists on having cold water. I nodded quickly, my head barely managing a yes, before I could call out to one of my friends in the neighborhood. There is no need to take her along, my mother said, adding in a tone that left little room for debate. You must go to the well alone, and be sure that no other girl is with you or trailing behind. Her words left me feeling utterly perplexed and alarmed. I had always been told time and again that I should never be seen with another girl on such trips, so as not to find myself in any compromising situation. But today, my mother was insisting that I go alone without any female companion whatsoever. Not only that, she added that I should keep far away from other girls and remain secluded, sitting by myself if need be. I watched her with a mixture of confusion and apprehension because these instructions were unlike her usual careful counsel. Typically, she would warn me to avoid the company of other girls so that I would not get into trouble, but now she was ordering me to go alone. For a brief moment, my heart pounded with the thought that maybe I should simply turn around and retreat. I almost wished I could cast aside everything and hide in my room, safe from any potential harm from my mother's unpredictable moods. But then a part of me hesitated. Perhaps my mother was speaking the truth, and I was mistakenly doubting her intentions. I decided to suppress my misgivings and continued on toward the well. When I arrived at the well, the scene that unfolded before me was startling. Before my very eyes, I saw 5 jet-black vehicles parked in a row. Among them, one particular car caught my attention immediately. It was unmistakably not someone else's vehicle, but that of Malik Sardar himself. There he stood, leaning casually against his car, his age clearly apparent, but still accompanied by an inexplicable aura of stern authority and an almost otherworldly grimness. His mere presence was enough to send shivers down the spine of everyone around him. Even the respected elders of the village, who normally spoke with calm deference, would lower their voices and speak softly in his presence, fearing that even the slightest word might provoke his wrath and lead him to mete out severe punishment. Yet here I was, standing before him because, despite my inner terror, I felt compelled only by the duty I owed to my family. If my family were given the freedom to do as they wished, without constraints or fear, I would have rejected the prospect of marriage with him a long time ago. I had no desire ever to ruin my life by entering into a union that would strip me of my dignity and happiness. But circumstances were not of my choosing, and I was left with no recourse but to endure. I stood there, trembling, as Malik's stern gaze bore into me. For several moments, he looked at me with a faint, almost mocking smile before he finally spoke in a measured tone. Do I need to send a message for you? Come quickly here. Today, I intend to take you to my Haveli. You have no idea how many decorations I have arranged in the Haveli, all for the sole purpose of pleasing you. I have even spoken to your mother about it, and she has no objections. She believes it is better for you to know about this now, so that later you will not face any difficulties. His words, meant to sound gentle and reassuring, filled me with a surge of panic. I quickly shook my head in disapproval, desperately trying to signal that I did not agree. In that moment, I foolishly thought that perhaps I had narrowly escaped being ensnared in this bizarre custom. Yet I was unaware that all these arrangements had been made long before I even voiced my silent dissent. Upon noticing my head shaking in refusal, his face darkened with anger once more. He gestured sharply to one of his guards, as if to prevent the guard from advancing toward me and forcibly taking me away, and then he stepped forward himself. "How can I allow some stranger to touch the woman who is to be my wife?" he declared in a voice filled with both authority and anger. He advanced on me, seizing me firmly as I tried in vain to free myself from his grip. His hold was strong and unyielding. Even at his advanced age, he possessed a surprising amount of physical power that left me trembling with fear. His intentions, combined with his imposing strength, made me feel that I was in the midst of imminent danger. After a short struggle, he forcefully shoved me into his car. As the vehicle started moving, he leaned close to my ear and whispered in a tone that was both threatening and disturbingly intimate. "What do you think? Shall I begin teaching you right here in this very moment?" I could feel my cheeks burn with shame and humiliation while a cold sweat broke out all over my body. I rubbed my hands together in a futile attempt to steady myself, but the terror inside me was insurmountable. For what felt like an eternity, the car sped along the deserted road. Suddenly, as if deciding to change his plan, he abruptly commanded that instead of taking me to his haveli, he would now take me to his farmhouse. This farmhouse was situated in a remote area, one so deserted that hardly anyone ever visited it. Unlike the haveli, where guests would continuously arrive and interrupt his designs, the farmhouse promised solitude. His words, delivered with an unsettling mix of calm authority and sinister intent, left me feeling as if I were trapped in a waking nightmare. I was barely able to keep my composure as the car rattled along. Before long, tears began streaming down my face uncontrollably. Seeing me in such a state, he suddenly became agitated. "What is this? Why are you letting your tears fall? Hold them in. You will need them again very soon," he admonished sharply. I could only nod in feeble agreement, folding my hands together in supplication as I whispered, "Please, for God's sake, have mercy on me. I cannot bear much more of this torment. We have no real relationship between us yet, so please, show me some kindness and let me go." He glowered at me for a long moment and then retorted bitterly, "Are you really spouting such Islamic rhetoric now? Be silent. Otherwise, if I lose my temper, I will treat you far worse than you can imagine. Do not force me to be harsh." His words, laced with an ominous promise of retribution, made my heart pound even more fiercely. I clutched my lips in a vain attempt to stifle the sobs that threatened to overwhelm me, while my tears continued unabated. In that car, with my dignity being trampled upon and my fate seemingly sealed, I pleaded silently with my creator for one more chance at saving my honor. After what seemed an endless stretch of time, the car finally pulled up in front of the farmhouse. Before me loomed a large, imposing bungalow, a structure so vast and foreboding that its very presence filled me with dread. The place looked deserted, with the aura of neglect and isolation hanging heavily in the air. I stood there, paralyzed by fear, my eyes fixed on the grim edifice, when suddenly he seized my arm and dragged me forcibly inside. I struggled with every ounce of strength I possessed, desperate to break free from his iron grip. His hold was relentless, and despite my frantic efforts, it seemed as though I was destined to remain captive. After roughly tossing me to the ground, he admonished me in a harsh tone. "I have told you before, do not make such a fuss with your behavior, for you never seem to understand a single word that is said to you." Hearing those words, I collapsed again, sobbing uncontrollably at his feet. Then, almost as if in response to my despair, I suddenly became aware of his relentless gaze. I raised my eyes, only to see him still looking down at my trembling back with a peculiar glint in his eyes, a look that was not entirely human. In that moment, I felt the crushing weight of my fate and knew I must somehow escape from his clutches. Before he could pull me further inside the bungalow, an unexpected commotion erupted outside. Gunfire suddenly rang out, the sound of bullets shattering the tense silence that had enveloped us. The shock of the sudden violence sent a jolt of terror through my body. "Sit down, quickly," he ordered as one of his guards hurried to him with urgent news. "The enemies have launched an attack here," he declared, and then he added in a hushed, almost regretful tone, "I nearly forgot that not far from here, another Sardar, the one I despise most, is our fiercest enemy." The mention of an enemy escalated my fear to an unbearable level. My heart raced uncontrollably, trembling as if it might burst from the pressure of the situation. In a matter of moments, darkness began to cloud my vision and I lost consciousness, falling into a void of oblivion. When I eventually came to, I found myself lying in the familiar surroundings of my home. My mother was seated nearby, her face etched with deep concern and worry. "Thank goodness," she murmured with relief. "Thank God you are awake. I thought I had lost you." Before I could speak, I began to grope for myself, checking to see if I had been harmed beyond repair. I closed my eyes and took a long, deep breath, thankful beyond words that my honor and body had survived the ordeal. My mother's expression shifted from relief to mild reproach as she remarked, "I had warned you that if anything were to happen, you would surely lose it all. If only you had taken my words seriously, you would have understood by now that once something is lost, no amount of effort can restore it." I could not help but feel a mix of humiliation and anger at her harsh words, yet, at that moment, my trembling hands and aching soul could muster no retort. I simply lay there, trying to piece together the fragments of my shattered dignity and the events of that horrid night. In the following days, as the chaos and fear gradually receded, I tried to gather the scattered remnants of my life. I found myself caught between the overwhelming desire to flee this place and the crushing realization that despite everything, my family's safety and honor were paramount. Every decision I made was dictated by the fear of what might happen if I were to be separated from my family, or if my actions might bring them further misfortune. I recalled all too vividly the day when I had almost made the fatal decision to run away, when I had been so overwhelmed by despair that I had thought to throw away my life right then and there. But as the hours passed, the urgency of survival and the duty I owed to my family eventually subdued those reckless thoughts. At the same time, I was constantly reminded of the relentless presence of Malik and his guards. No matter where I turned, the threat of his influence and his men lingered like a dark shadow over my every move. Every moment was punctuated by the memory of his forceful grip, the sinister glint in his eyes, and the unbearable weight of his authority. It was a torture of the mind and soul, a living nightmare that made each day feel interminably long and every night even more agonizing. There were times when I would lie awake, heart pounding, replaying the terrifying incidents in my mind over and over again. I would wonder if the sound of distant gunfire had been a sign of some salvation or yet another harbinger of doom. The overwhelming terror that had gripped me during those desperate moments at the farmhouse never truly left me. I was haunted by the sensation of helplessness and the bitter realization that I had been caught in a web of events that I could neither escape from nor control. My inner voice screamed for freedom, for a chance to reclaim my dignity and secure a future where I would no longer be at the mercy of cruel fate or despotic men. As the day of my wedding approached, the dread in my heart grew even more unbearable. I knew deep inside that Malik was extremely angry with me, and I feared that his wrath would leave me no room to breathe. The thought of my upcoming marriage, which should have been a celebration of new beginnings, filled me with such profound anxiety that I entertained the wild notion of simply abandoning the wedding altogether and fleeing far, far away. But every time I attempted to gather the courage to escape, I realized that his guards were everywhere around the house, ever watchful and ever ready to thwart any attempt of defiance. It was as if they knew every secret thought I had, every silent prayer I uttered in the darkness of the night. Even my dearest friend, who sat quietly by my side throughout these ordeals, could not mask the fear that clung to every whispered word. At one point, as she leaned in close and murmured in my ear with an intensity that surpassed her earlier gentle tones, I was forced to clasp my hands together in a desperate plea. "For God's sake, please, just let me leave here safely. I cannot endure another moment of this agony. I fear that if I am forced to stay any longer, I might faint right on the spot." She only laughed softly and replied in a voice that was at once both mocking and sympathetic. "Oh, you're bound to faint eventually. It's only a matter of time. But come now, remember what a good friend I have been to you through all of this." Despite her reassurances, the terror that had seized me was too overwhelming to ignore. Amid all this inner turmoil and rising panic, the arrival of the wedding day felt like the final, unbearable test. The house was abuzz with the noise and commotion of the barat. Yet deep inside, I felt only dread and resignation. I could barely muster the energy to stand, let alone face the prospect of being paraded off to a life I had never chosen. My mother, who had always been stern and unyielding, seemed determined to press forward with the arrangements. In a moment of sheer exasperation, she clutched me in both her arms, almost as if to force me to accept the fate that had been written for me by circumstances beyond my control. I felt a mixture of anger and profound sorrow as I realized that I was being handed over like an object to that 60-year-old man, a man whose cold authority and domineering nature had haunted every corner of my life. Eventually, the time came for the wedding ceremony. I was led to the bridal bed where Malik sat waiting. For a long while, he simply kept his eyes closed, as if lost in thought, before finally sitting down beside me. After a while, he reached beneath the pillow and produced a large amount of jewelry. Holding the glittering ornaments in his hand, he declared, "From this day forward, these jewels shall be yours." His tone was devoid of any warmth, yet his act was meant to symbolize the traditional exchange that bound the bride to the groom. Despite the fact that his gesture was nothing more than a customary ritual, a ritual that in many marriages would be celebrated, I could not help but seethe with anger. How could someone who had caused me such pain and terror possibly believe that this token of wealth could make up for the horror I had already experienced? Deep inside, I felt a tumultuous storm of emotions: rage at the cruelty of my fate, sorrow at the loss of the life I might have had, and a desperate yearning to reclaim my dignity. Though my body trembled with fear, my mind screamed for freedom. I silently cursed the circumstances that had led me to this moment, where even the most trivial of gestures carried the weight of an oppressive destiny. In that dark, relentless hour, I was left alone with my thoughts, and I began to pray fervently for a miracle, one that might grant me a future free from abuse and coercion. I vowed to myself that if I survived this ordeal, I would someday find a way to break these chains that bound me. Despite the terror that continued to grip my heart, a small spark of hope burned within me, a hope that even the darkest nights might give way to a brighter dawn. Thus, as the ceremony proceeded and the echoes of the wedding chants filled the space, I remained inwardly defiant. I knew that however painful and unjust my situation was, I would someday be free. My eyes, though filled with tears, burned with a quiet determination, a determination to one day reclaim my life and honor, to rise above the tyranny and cruelty that had been forced upon me. In that final moment before the marriage was consummated, I felt a deep, searing sorrow for the life I had lost and the future that had been taken from me. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm me, I clung to the belief that my suffering would not be in vain. I silently promised myself that someday, somehow, I would find a way to escape this oppressive existence and rebuild my life in a place where I could finally be safe and respected. And so, with the heavy burden of humiliation and fear upon my heart, I lay down that day, surrounded by the oppressive rituals and the echoes of a fate I never chose, fate that, despite its cruelty, I resolved to someday overcome. I prayed that the scars left by these dark hours would one day give way to the healing light of freedom and dignity.